We still have some work to do. We need to wire up our image loading as the user navigates through the records. For each item, we'll want to load the appropriate image. Press F7 to go into the code. Let's take a look at what we have in this code. When you automatically start creating table adapters and bringing them onto your form, Visual Studio will automatically add a default fill method for you in the load method for your form. This may or may not be desirable behavior. It's okay that we do this for the items and categories because the item fill will populate all the items into our details view and the category fill will populate all the categories into our dropdown, but for images, we don't want to do a default fill. Let's take this method and change it. Instead of a generic fill, let's use one of the custom properties that we've already created. We want to be able to pass in item ID and load the images based on the item ID we pass in. So select the Fill Images by Item ID property. Also note that because it's not a generic fill, we'll also need to provide a parameter. The first parameter will be our data table. The second will be an integer representing our item ID. As you remember, we have a label on our form that stores the item ID. Let's convert this label to an integer and use this as a parameter to pass into the Fill Images by Item ID. So let's use the convert to int 32 and convert this label. Select item ID label 1, select its text property, close the parentheses. Also keep in mind this item ID label property is bound to our item data source. Take a look at this code. Based on the order of execution, our item ID isn't going to be populated until after we try to populate our images. This doesn't make any sense. Let's copy this into our clipboard. Let's move this code. And let's clean up some of the unnecessary commenting code. Okay, our load looks good now. We're going to fill the drop-down list, we're going to fill the items, and then based on what items were populated, we're going to fill the images based on the item ID inside of our item label. That's not all we need to do. The next thing we need to do is configure navigation so that when the user navigates from one item to the next, we automatically repopulate the images based on that particular item ID. Press Shift F7 to go back to the designer. We can hook into this navigation using the item binding source events. Select the item binding source. Select the events icon in the properties window. We want to capture the movement as the user walks through the items in the data adapter. We can do this with the position change event, which is raised every time the user navigates to another item. Let's double click on this to drop into our position change event for our item source. Let's add a try block. Type in try, hit tab twice. Let's grab the fill that we used earlier. Let's copy this into our clipboard and then go back down into our binding source property. Inside of the try, let's add a conditional. We want to make sure that the item ID label actually has a value in it. The position change event can be fired at the very beginning when there's no data loaded. So let's make sure we check for the condition that the item ID label is populated, and then we'll go ahead and fill our item table as we did earlier. So type in if parentheses, select item ID label 1, select the text property, check it to be not equal to the string.empty property. Inside the brackets for the if, let's paste in the code from our clipboard. Now we can see that if the item ID label is not empty, we'll go ahead and fill the items, and this will happen every time the binding source's position has changed. Let's run the application. Select the Create Item button. As you can see, our load is working very nicely. We're only seeing thumbnails that belong to our first item. Let's see if the navigation in our binding navigator works. Select Next. As you can see, our Next button now works. Because we modified our data grid properties, you can't even see that we actually had a data grid there. Select Next again. As you can see, our functionality is working correctly. Let's go back to Visual Studio and stop the application.